Hey everyone, I'm so glad to see you all. By the way, where are you watching from? I'm from Texas, America. Write in the comments, I look forward to your comments. It's so exciting to know where you're all from.
Mail carrier notices stains on elderly woman's pants, enters her home, and immediately calls 911. Cameron had always found solace in his routine. For the past 5 years, he had delivered letters through the winding streets of his small town, a tight-knit community where everyone knew one another. Each day had its rhythm, a comforting pattern that lured him out of bed and into the morning air, crisp and fragrant with the scent of pine and freshly baked bread from the nearby bakery. It was a life filled with simple joys, a friendly wave from the local grocer, a smile from the children on their way to school, and the satisfaction of knowing he was the bearer of news, both good and bad. Among his regular customers was Nyonya Margaret, an elderly woman who had lived alone in a weathered white house at the end of Maple Street. The house, with its peeling paint and overgrown garden, had once been a vibrant place filled with laughter and the pitter-patter of little feet. Now it stood in stark contrast to the bustling life surrounding it, an eerie reminder of the past. Nyonya Margaret was known for her warm demeanor and infectious laughter, but lately, Cameron had sensed a change in her. As he approached her home one foggy morning, Cameron's heart raced slightly. It was the day before Halloween, and the air had taken on a chill that sent shivers down his spine. He glanced at the sky, grey and heavy with clouds, as if foreshadowing something dark. He had always appreciated Nyonya Margaret's company during his deliveries, exchanging pleasantries and stories about the town, but today felt different. There was a tension in the air, a foreboding presence that weighed heavily on his chest. He reached her front porch and knocked gently on the door, the sound echoing against the quietness of the neighborhood. After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing Nyonya Margaret standing in the entryway. But as he looked closer, unease gripped him. She appeared frail, her once bright eyes now clouded and distant. The wrinkles etched into her skin seemed deeper, and there was an unsettling pallor to her complexion. "Good morning, Nyonya Margaret," he said, forcing a smile. "How are you today?" "Ah, Cameron, dear," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just peachy, thank you." But something was off. Cameron's gaze drifted downward, and he noticed a dark stain on her pants, a stark contrast against the faded fabric. It was a deep red, almost black in the dim light of the porch. His heart raced as he fought to quell the panic rising within him. Was that blood? "Nyonya Margaret, is everything all right?" he asked, concern creeping into his voice. "Oh, don't worry about me, dear," she said, attempting to wave off his concern. Yet her smile faltered and her eyes darted away, betraying a flicker of fear that sent chills down his spine. Cameron felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "Are you sure? You look a little unwell." She hesitated, her expression shifting from uncertainty to something darker, more profound. "It's nothing, really. Just a little mishap in the kitchen," her words dripped with unease, and a shadow crossed her face, one that spoke of secrets hidden behind closed doors. But Cameron couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He had always known Nyonya Margaret to be a resilient woman, one who faced the world with a brave smile. The woman standing before him was a mere shadow of her former self, cloaked in an air of desperation that tugged at his heart. "I can't leave you like this," he declared, stepping closer to her, his instincts kicking in. "Let me come in and check on you." The moment the words left his lips, he saw her body stiffen. "Oh no, dear, really, it's not necessary," she insisted, but Cameron could sense the trembling in her voice. "Please, let me help," he pressed, stepping through the threshold, ignoring the protests that lingered in the air. As he crossed into her home, he was immediately struck by the oppressive silence that enveloped the space. The familiar scents of lavender and old books were overpowered by something far more sinister. A rancid smell hung in the air, a mix of decay and something sharper, more metallic. Cameron's skin prickled with unease. "Are you sure you're all right?" he asked, trying to gauge the situation. "Just a little tired, dear," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "Why don't you take a seat?" He obliged, sitting down on a fraying armchair that seemed to sag under his weight. As he scanned the room, his heart sank. The once cozy living area was in disarray, cluttered with unwashed dishes and old newspapers. It felt like a prison of memories, locked away behind the shadows of neglect. But it was the stain on her pants that gnawed at him. "Nyanya Margaret," he said slowly, "about that stain. It looks serious." "Oh, don't concern yourself with such trivialities," she muttered, but there was a crack in her voice. "Just a little accident, I assure you." His instincts screamed at him to dig deeper. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I can't ignore this. If you need help, you can trust me. Just tell me what happened." For a moment he thought she would break, the facade crumbling as tears glistened in her eyes. But instead she shook her head vigorously. No, it's really nothing, Cameron. Just a bit of bad luck. I promise." Cameron took a deep breath, feeling a mix of frustration and helplessness. "I'm calling someone. You need to see a doctor." As he reached for his phone, the silence in the room was shattered by a sudden noise, a crash from the kitchen that sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. Cameron shot up from his seat, heart pounding in his chest. "What was that?" he exclaimed, eyes wide. Nyanya Margaret's face turned pale, and for a fleeting moment he saw pure terror reflected in her eyes. "You mustn't go in there," she cried, her voice cracking. Ignoring her, Cameron made his way to the kitchen, compelled by a sense of duty and the gnawing feeling that something was gravely wrong. As he stepped into the room, the sight that met his eyes was chilling. The kitchen was a scene of chaos. Dishes lay shattered on the floor, and there were more stains, dark, splotchy stains smeared across the countertops and the floor, leading into the corner of the room. His breath caught in his throat as he followed the trail, which seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It was blood, he realized, the harsh reality crashing down on him. "Nyanya Margaret," he called out, panic clawing at his throat. "What happened here?" But there was no response. Only the eerie echo of his voice filled the room, mingling with the oppressive silence that followed. Cameron felt a cold sweat trickle down his back as he turned to look for her, dread coiling in his stomach. As he rushed back into the living room, he was met with the sight of Nyanya Margaret, now standing at the entrance, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and something else, something dark. "You shouldn't have come in here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why are you acting like this? What happened?" Cameron pressed, his heart racing. Suddenly, the reality of the situation sank in, and he realized that he was no longer just a letter carrier delivering mail. He had stumbled into a nightmare. "Please, just tell me what's going on," he begged, his voice breaking. But as he looked into her eyes, he understood that whatever horror lay hidden in this house was far deeper than he could comprehend. The sense of urgency surged within him. He reached for his phone again, dialing 911 with trembling fingers, the call connecting with an eerie silence. As he reported the situation, he felt a creeping sense of dread slither up his spine. Nyanya Margaret's expression shifted from fear to something darker, something that made him question if he could truly trust her. "Help is on the way," he said, trying to reassure both her and himself. But even as the words left his lips, a deep sense of foreboding took root in his gut. What had he uncovered? And would it be enough to save Nyanya Margaret from whatever malevolence lurked in the shadows of her home? As he hung up, he turned to face her again. The room felt like it was closing in, the walls echoing with the weight of untold stories and buried secrets. Nyanya Margaret's eyes flickered with a warning, and for the first time, Cameron felt a chilling realization settle in. The stain was only the beginning. The air was thick with tension as Cameron stood in the dim light of Nyanya Margaret's living room, the eerie silence enveloping him like a suffocating shroud. He felt his heart hammering in his chest as he tried to make sense of the chaos around him. Nyanya Margaret, once a source of warmth and comfort in his daily routine, now seemed like a ghost haunting the remnants of her own home. The sharp contrast between her vibrant past and the current desolation only deepened his unease. As he glanced at her, he could see that the frail woman was trembling slightly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as if she were trying to hold herself together. The light that had once danced in her eyes was now replaced by a glazed, haunted look that sent a chill down his spine. He wondered what horrors she had endured in the very home that had once been filled with laughter and joy. "Nyanya Margaret," he said softly, taking a step closer, "please, you need to tell me what happened. I can't help you if you don't open up to me." She stared at him, her expression a mixture of fear and uncertainty. It's not safe, she finally whispered, her voice trembling. You shouldn't be here. Not safe, he echoed, confusion clouding his mind. What do you mean? What's going on? Is someone after you? A shadow crossed her face as if she were grappling with something unspeakable. Cameron felt a surge of frustration and urgency. He needed to break through her defenses. I can't protect you if you don't let me in. Please, he urged, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. Nyonya Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, as if steeling herself for the words that were about to come. It's my son, Daniel, she said finally, her voice a mere whisper. He's back. Cameron's heart raced at the mention of her son. The stories he had heard over the years about Daniel were far from pleasant. A troubled young man, Daniel had been involved in drugs and petty crime, leading to his disappearance a decade ago. Whispers of his violent tendencies lingered in the town, and when he vanished, most believed it was for the best. Why would that matter now? Cameron asked cautiously, fearing what he might learn next. Is he the one who hurt you? No, it's not like that, she cried, panic rising in her voice. I don't know why he came back. I thought he was gone for good, but her words trailed off and she seemed to retreat into herself, haunted by memories she couldn't escape.
Did he hurt you? Cameron pressed, desperate for clarity. Nyonya Margaret shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. He came back one night, and I thought I could help him, but he's not the same anymore. Something has changed in him. He keeps talking about things I don't understand. Cameron felt a knot tighten in his stomach. What kind of things? He asked, leaning closer. Dark things, she whispered, her voice trembling. He said he's seen things that have changed him forever. And then he started acting strange, as if he were possessed. A cold wave washed over Cameron as he processed her words. The darkness that once claimed Daniel had returned, and it seemed to have brought something else with it. What do you mean by possessed? He asked, his voice low. Nyonya Margaret glanced around the room, as if expecting someone to materialize from the shadows. I can't explain it, she said, her voice barely audible. He talks to himself, and I've seen him standing in the dark, staring at the walls. Sometimes, I hear him muttering about rituals and sacrifices. Cameron's heart sank. Rituals, he repeated, the word heavy in the air. What kind of rituals? I don't know, she cried, her hands trembling. I just want him to go away, but he won't leave me. He keeps saying he needs me for something important. Where is he now? Cameron asked, scanning the room for signs of danger. He's in the basement, she admitted, her voice shaking. I tried to keep the door locked, but he's found a way to get in. I'm scared, Cameron. I don't know what he wants from me. A surge of adrenaline shot through Cameron. We need to call the police. You need to be safe. No, she exclaimed, grabbing his arm with surprising strength. You can't. If you do, he'll be angry. You don't know what he's capable of. Cameron's mind raced. He had to act, but he couldn't put Nyonya Margaret in more danger. Then what do we do? He pressed, desperation creeping into his voice. Her eyes darted around the room, as if searching for a solution. We need to get out of here, she said urgently. If he finds out I'm talking to you, he'll... Suddenly a loud crash echoed from the basement, interrupting her words. Cameron's heart skipped a beat, and he froze in place, adrenaline coursing through him like fire. What was that? He gasped, his instincts screaming at him to run. I don't know. Nyonya Margaret's voice was frantic. He's coming. We have to hide. With no time to think, Cameron grabbed her hand, pulling her towards the kitchen, which had become a whirlwind of chaos. They darted into a narrow pantry, the darkness swallowing them whole as they squeezed in together, breathless. Inside, the smell of old spices and something foul engulfed them, and Cameron felt the walls closing in. He could hear his heart pounding in his ears as he pressed his back against the cool metal of the shelves. Nyonya Margaret stood beside him, trembling, her eyes wide with fear. Through the thin walls of the pantry, they could hear the faint sound of footsteps echoing from the basement, heavy and deliberate. Cameron's heart raced as he wondered what Daniel was doing down there. Had he heard them? Minutes felt like hours as they waited in tense silence. Cameron could feel Nyonya Margaret's heartbeat matching his, a steady reminder of their shared fear. He wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be all right. but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were both trapped in a nightmare of someone else's making. Just as he began to wonder if they could risk escaping, the footsteps grew louder, drawing closer to the kitchen. A shadow passed by the pantry door, and Cameron's breath caught in his throat. He could see the outline of a figure moving through the kitchen, pausing as if sensing something in the air. Cameron's mind raced. They couldn't stay hidden forever. They needed a plan, a way to outsmart whatever darkness had taken hold of Daniel. But what could they do? He had to keep Nyanya Margaret safe, and that meant confronting the nightmare head-on. Finally, as the footsteps receded, Cameron turned to Nyanya Margaret, who was visibly shaken. "We need to get out of here," he whispered urgently. "We can't wait any longer." With a nod, she took a deep breath, summoning whatever strength she had left. Together, they slowly opened the pantry door, peering out into the kitchen, where chaos still reigned. Dishes lay scattered, remnants of Daniel's breakdown evident everywhere. Cameron motioned for Nyanya Margaret to follow him, and they crept toward the back door, trying to make as little noise as possible. Each creak of the floorboards felt like a scream in the silence, and he held his breath, praying they wouldn't be caught. Just as they reached the door, a voice echoed through the house, low and menacing. "Mother, where are you?" The voice sent chills down Cameron's spine, filled with an unsettling familiarity. "It's too late for you, Mother. You can't hide from me." Cameron felt a surge of fear and determination wash over him. They had to escape before it was too late. With a firm grip on the doorknob, he turned it slowly, praying it wouldn't creak. "Let's go," he whispered urgently, pushing the door open just enough for them to slip through. As they stepped outside, a rush of cold air enveloped them, and they sprinted into the backyard, hearts pounding. They needed to find safety, to escape the dark shadows that loomed behind them. As they dashed toward the gate, Cameron felt an unsettling presence lurking in the darkness, a reminder that they were not free yet. They were still trapped in the grip of something far more sinister than either of them could comprehend. And as they reached the fence, Cameron glanced back at the house one last time, the flickering light of a single lamp illuminating the darkened windows. He could feel the weight of their reality pressing down on him. Whatever had taken hold of Nyanya Margaret and her son was far from over. This was only the beginning of a nightmare that would test their courage and resilience in ways they never imagined. The night air felt charged with electricity as Cameron and Nyanya Margaret sprinted across the backyard, adrenaline surging through their veins. The shadows cast by the dim streetlights loomed large, stretching across the grass like dark fingers reaching out to snatch them back into the nightmare they were trying to escape. "Where do we go?" Nyanya Margaret panted, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting her son to emerge from the darkness at any moment. "We need to find somewhere safe, maybe Mrs. Whitaker's house down the street," Cameron replied, scanning the area for any signs of danger. The familiar streets of their small town, usually comforting, now felt like a labyrinth of terror. Each rustle of leaves and distant sound echoed ominously in the night. As they reached the back gate, Cameron pushed it open, the creaking hinges sounding like a death knell in the stillness. They bolted onto Maple Street, the pavement cold beneath their feet. "Keep moving," he urged, urging Nyanya Margaret to quicken her pace. They rounded the corner and hurried down the block. The quiet of the neighborhood amplified their hurried breaths. "Cameron, we can't just run blindly." "What if he catches us?" she gasped, fear lacing her voice. "He won't," he insisted, but doubt gnawed at him. What if Daniel was already on their trail, fueled by whatever dark forces had overtaken him? "We just need to get to Mrs. Whitaker's. She can help us." As they sprinted toward the end of the block, a sudden noise froze them in their tracks. The sound of a door slamming echoed through the night, sharp and jarring. Cameron turned sharply to see a figure emerging from the shadows, tall and imposing. Daniel. Nyanya Margaret's voice trembled, panic setting in. "Stay back," Cameron shouted, stepping protectively in front of her, fists clenched. The figure paused, his features obscured by the darkness, but there was no mistaking the menacing aura that surrounded him. "Mother, where are you going?" Daniel's voice was low, almost a growl. "You can't leave me. We have things to do together." Cameron felt a cold sweat bead on his forehead. "We're not going anywhere with you," he shouted, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Daniel took a step forward, and in the streetlight, Cameron caught a glimpse of his face. The boy who once had transformed into a stranger, his eyes were wild. The iris is a deep, unsettling shade of black. The darkness around him seemed to pulse, as if feeding off his rage and confusion. "Why did you bring him here?" Daniel hissed, glancing at Cameron with a mix of rage and bewilderment. "You're not supposed to interfere." "He's not interfering, Daniel. You need help," Nyanya Margaret pleaded, her voice breaking as she reached out toward her son. "This isn't you." "Help," Daniel spat, a twisted grin spreading across his face. "Help is for the weak. You don't understand what I've become." Cameron's heart raced as he tried to gauge Daniel's next move. "You're not a monster, Daniel. You can fight this," he shouted, desperation creeping into his tone. But Daniel's laughter echoed hollowly through the night, sending a chill down Cameron's spine. "Fight it? There's no fighting what I've become. I've seen things that you can't even begin to comprehend." He took another step forward, and Cameron could feel the malevolent energy radiating off him. "Stay back," Cameron warned, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He could see Nyanya Margaret trembling behind him, her eyes wide with fear. "Let her go," Daniel Cameron said, a surge of defiance rising within him. "You don't want to hurt her." "She's mine," he said, his voice suddenly calm, almost eerily so. "And I'll do whatever it takes to keep her by my side." Cameron's thoughts raced as he frantically searched for a way to de-escalate the situation. "What do you want?" he asked, trying to appeal to whatever humanity still lingered within Daniel. "You don't understand." "Do you?" Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper, dripping with malice. "There's power in the darkness. I'm not afraid of it anymore. I've embraced it." In that moment, a decision snapped into focus for Cameron. They needed to distract him, to buy them some time to escape. "If you really believe that, then prove it," he shouted, his voice rising. "Show me what you can do." For a brief moment, Daniel paused, his expression shifting from rage to intrigue. "What are you suggesting?" he asked, curiosity edging into his tone. "Show me your power," Cameron pressed, heart racing. "If you're so strong, then you shouldn't be afraid of anyone." The flicker of hesitation in Daniel's eyes told Cameron he was on the right track. "You think I'm afraid?" Daniel scoffed, but his bravado wavered slightly. "Then let us go," Cameron said, seizing the moment. "You can keep your mother, but let us walk away. I won't say anything to anyone. This is your chance to prove you're in control." Nyanya Margaret's hand tightened on Cameron's arm, fear etched on her face. "Cameron, don't provoke him," she whispered, desperation in her voice. But Daniel's eyes burned with a dangerous curiosity. "You think I need permission to let you go?" he asked, stepping closer, the shadows swirling around him like dark tendrils. "You think you're in control?" Cameron felt a thrill of fear mixed with determination. "Then let us leave and you can prove how powerful you are." For a moment, the world around them fell into a heavy silence, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Daniel's face twisted in thought, his features obscured by the shadows. Suddenly, without warning, he lunged forward and Cameron's instincts kicked in. He shoved Nyanya Margaret behind him, adrenaline flooding his system. "Run," he shouted, adrenaline surging as he pushed her toward the end of the street. But before they could escape, Daniel's hand shot out, grabbing Cameron by the wrist with an iron grip. "You think you can just leave?" he hissed, his breath hot against Cameron's face. "You're not going anywhere." Cameron twisted and yanked his arm free, heart pounding. "Let her go," he shouted, panic fueling his movements. But Daniel was already advancing, rage flickering in his eyes. "You don't understand, do you? You're part of this now. You can't just walk away." Cameron, Nyanya Margaret screamed, her voice laced with fear as she watched the confrontation unfold. In that instant, Cameron knew he had to act fast. He glanced to the side and spotted a loose branch lying on the ground. With a quick lunge, he grabbed it, brandishing it like a weapon. "Get back," he shouted, raising the branch defiantly. Daniel paused, confusion flickering across his face. "You think that's going to stop me?" "It's better than nothing," Cameron shouted, adrenaline surging as he prepared to defend himself. He could feel his heart racing, the stakes rising with each passing second. But before he could react further, a loud siren echoed through the night, growing closer by the second. The sound seemed to cut through the tension like a knife, and Daniel's expression shifted from anger to frustration. "This isn't over," Daniel spat, backing away slightly as if calculating his next move. Cameron seized the opportunity, grabbing Nyanya Margaret's hand and sprinting down the street, toward the approaching lights. "We have to get to Mrs. Whitaker's," he urged, not daring to look back. As they ran, the sirens grew louder, a cacophony of hope mingled with terror. They dashed around the corner, breathless, racing against the darkness that threatened to consume them. In the distance, Cameron could see the flashing lights of the police cars illuminating the night, a beacon of safety. But he couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel was still lurking, watching them from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. They reached the entrance to Mrs. Whitaker's house, and Cameron slammed his hand against the door, pounding desperately. "Open up. Please," he shouted, urgency spilling from his lips. The door swung open, revealing Mrs. Whitaker, her eyes wide with shock. "What's going on?" she asked, glancing back nervously. "Let us in," Cameron urged, pulling Nyanya Margaret inside just as the police sirens grew louder. They rushed into the safety of the house, slamming the door behind them, and leaned against it, panting. "Is he coming?" Nyanya Margaret gasped, her voice shaking. "I don't know," Cameron replied, his heart still racing. "But we need to call the police and tell them everything." Mrs. Whitaker grabbed her phone and quickly dialed, her expression turning serious as she listened to the dispatcher on the other end. Cameron felt a mix of relief and dread wash over him. They were safe for now, but the shadow of Daniel loomed larger than ever. As Mrs. Whitaker hung up, she turned to them, her brows furrowed. "They're on their way, but you need to tell me everything. What happened out there?" Cameron exchanged a glance with Nyanya Margaret, knowing the truth would shatter the fragile calm they had found. But there was no turning back now. They had to face the reality of what they were dealing with. "Daniel. He's changed," Nyanya Margaret said, her voice barely a whisper. "He's not the same boy I once knew." Cameron took a deep breath, the weight of the night pressing down on him. "And whatever darkness he's embraced, it's dangerous. We're not safe yet." As they huddled together, the night continued to unfold, the shadows dancing just beyond the door, waiting for the chance to reclaim what was theirs. The fight was far from over, and as the sirens drew nearer, Cameron knew they had only just begun to unravel the truth behind the nightmare that threatened to consume them all. The police sirens faded into the background as Cameron and Nyanya Margaret caught their breath inside Mrs. Whitaker's home. The warmth of the living room felt like a stark contrast to the chilling events outside. The flickering light from the old lamp cast long shadows on the walls, a reminder of the darkness they had just escaped. "Mrs. Whitaker," Cameron said, his voice steadying as he faced her. "You need to know what's been happening. Daniel, he's not himself anymore. He's involved in something dark, something dangerous." Mrs. Whitaker nodded, her expression serious. "I saw him earlier today, wandering the streets. He looked unwell, agitated." She paused, glancing toward Nyanya Margaret, who stood trembling by the window, her eyes darting anxiously toward the street. "What did he do to you, Margaret?" "I don't know," Nyanya Margaret replied, her voice quaking. "I thought he had come back to ask for help, but he's different, so much darker. He spoke about things I couldn't understand." Cameron stepped closer to Nyanya Margaret, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Whatever he's involved in, we need to stop him before he hurts anyone else. We can't let him go back to that darkness." Mrs. Whitaker's gaze hardened. "Then we must do something before it's too late. We can't wait for the police to arrive. They won't understand what we're dealing with." Before they could formulate a plan, the door rattled violently, echoing through the house. The three of them froze, eyes wide with fear. "That's him," Nyanya Margaret gasped, instinctively moving closer to Cameron. "Stay back," he instructed, standing between her and the door, his heart racing as the knocking grew more aggressive. "We can't let him in." "Open up. I know you're in there," Daniel's voice boomed from the other side, filled with a wild intensity that sent shivers down Cameron's spine. "Mother, let me in. I just want to talk." "No," Cameron shouted, his voice firm. "We're not letting you in." "Let me in." Daniel banged on the door again, the sound echoing in the silence. "You don't understand. I'm in control now. I have the power." "Power?" Mrs. Whitaker scoffed, her voice shaky yet defiant. "What kind of power?" "The kind that hurts people." There was a pause, and Cameron could sense the tension thickening in the air. "You're all afraid," Daniel called out, his voice eerily calm now. "You think I'm a monster, but you don't see the truth. I'm just trying to protect what's mine." "What's yours?" Daniel Nyanya Margaret pleaded, her voice breaking. "You can't protect anything through violence. You're hurting people." Daniel laughed, a chilling sound that sent goosebumps racing across Cameron's skin. You think you can talk me down? You have no idea what I've seen, what I've become. I'm beyond your understanding. Cameron glanced at Mrs. Whitaker, their shared fear palpable. We need to find a way to distract him, he whispered urgently. If he thinks he's got the upper hand, he'll be more reckless. Suddenly, Mrs. Whitaker stepped forward, determination glinting in her eyes. We need to show him that we're not afraid. We have to confront him. Confront him, Cameron echoed, incredulous. He's unstable. He could hurt you. He already has, she shot back, her voice fierce. And if we don't stand up to him, he'll keep coming after you, Margaret. He needs to understand that he can't just control you through fear. Cameron felt a swell of respect for the older woman, but the risks weighed heavily on him. What do you suggest? Open the door, she said firmly. But we'll be ready. We can't let him in completely. If he tries to push his way in, we'll stop him. Nyonya Margaret shook her head, panic rising. I can't face him. Not like this. You can, Cameron said, taking her hands in his. You're stronger than you think. We'll be right here with you. Just stand your ground. With a deep breath, he approached the door, heart pounding as he reached for the knob. You ready? He asked Nyonya Margaret, who nodded hesitantly, determination creeping into her eyes. Okay, Cameron said, steeling himself. On the count of 3. He counted down, and as he turned the knob, the door swung open, revealing Daniel standing in the dark, his figure silhouetted against the streetlight. His expression was a mixture of anger and desperation, the madness in his eyes palpable. Mother, he shouted, his voice echoing with an unsettling mixture of fear and rage. You have to come with me. No, Daniel, Nyonya Margaret responded, stepping forward with a newfound strength. You don't control me anymore. Control, Daniel's voice dripped with contempt. You think you can just turn your back on me? After everything I've done for you? You've done nothing but bring pain, she yelled back, her voice steady. This isn't the son I raised. Cameron felt the tension crackling in the air, every heartbeat echoing in his ears. Daniel, we're not afraid of you, he shouted, stepping beside Nyonya Margaret. You can't intimidate us anymore. Is that so? Daniel challenged, a twisted smile creeping across his face. Then maybe I need to show you just how powerful I really am. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted as darkness seemed to swirl around him. Cameron felt a wave of dread wash over him as he realized Daniel was summoning something, tapping into that unholy power he had mentioned before. Cameron, watch out, Nyonya Margaret screamed, and Cameron barely had time to react as Daniel lunged forward, the shadows coiling around him like living tendrils. Cameron ducked just in time, grabbing Nyonya Margaret and pulling her behind him. We have to get back, he shouted, trying to shield her from the encroaching darkness. As the shadows lashed out, Mrs. Whitaker stepped forward, raising her hands. Stop this, Daniel. You don't have to do this. The shadows hesitated, momentarily faltering as Daniel's focus shifted. You don't understand what I'm capable of, he roared, frustration boiling over. I'm beyond all of you. Cameron seized the moment, taking a step closer. You're not beyond anyone, Daniel. You're lost, and we can help you if you let us. Daniel's eyes narrowed, uncertainty flickering in the depths of his rage. Help, he spat, the shadows wavering slightly. You think I need help from you? If you keep this up, you'll only destroy yourself, Cameron pressed, his voice steady. We can work together, but you need to stop this madness. Enough, Daniel screamed, and with a violent gesture, the shadows surged forward again, lashing out toward them. Get down, Cameron yelled, pushing Nyonya Margaret and Mrs. Whitaker aside as he braced himself for impact. The dark tendril struck, slamming against the door frame and sending splintering wood flying. The force of the shadows knocked Cameron to the ground, disorienting him as the world spun. He scrambled to his feet, his heart racing, but Daniel was already advancing, fury radiating from him like heat from a fire. Daniel, stop, Nyonya Margaret shouted, her voice laced with desperation. You're hurting people you love. At her words, Daniel hesitated, confusion flickering across his face. Love? What do you know about love, he growled, but the shadows around him trembled, wavering as if reacting to his emotional turmoil. We love you, Nyonya Margaret cried, tears streaming down her face. You're my son. We just want you back. For a heartbeat, silence reigned, the shadows stalling in their movements as Daniel's expression shifted from rage to something softer. You love me, he whispered, disbelief mingling with pain. Cameron felt the weight of the moment, sensing an opportunity. "Yes, we do," he said, his voice steady. "But you need to fight whatever darkness is inside you. You're stronger than this." Suddenly the shadows around Daniel flickered, and he staggered back, confusion etched on his face. "I don't know how," he murmured, his voice trembling. "Then let us help you." Nyonya Margaret reached out, desperation and hope mingling in her gaze. "Please, let us help you find your way back." In that moment, the darkness seemed to recede slightly, and Daniel's grip on the shadows weakened. He looked at his mother, then at Cameron, uncertainty filling his eyes. "I don't know if I can," he admitted, his voice cracking. "You can," Cameron urged, taking a cautious step forward. "You just have to choose to fight it. We'll stand by you." For a fleeting moment, it seemed as if Daniel was about to surrender, the shadows wavering in response to his internal struggle. But then, the darkness roared back to life, pushing him further into its grasp. "No," Daniel shouted, shaking his head violently. "I can't let you go. You're mine." Cameron's heart sank as he realized the battle was far from over. The darkness around Daniel surged, angry and wild, ready to reclaim him. "Get back," Cameron shouted, and as the shadows lunged toward them once again, he grabbed Nyonya Margaret and Mrs. Whitaker, pulling them away from the impending storm. "We have to escape." As they dashed back into the house, the darkness howled behind them, the sound echoing like a furious wind. They slammed the door shut, panting as they leaned against it, trying to catch their breath. "What do we do now?" Nyonya Margaret asked, her voice trembling with fear. Cameron's mind raced, the urgency of the situation pressing down on him. "We need to find a way to break the hold that darkness has over him," he said, determination igniting within him. "There must be something we can do." Mrs. Whitaker nodded, her expression grave. "There's always a way. We just need to find it." As they gathered themselves, the sound of sirens finally broke through the oppressive tension. Hope flickered in Cameron's chest, but he knew the fight was far from over. The darkness still loomed, threatening to consume them all. "We can't let him win," he said, steeling himself for the challenges ahead. "We need to be ready for whatever comes next." Together, they stood united against the shadows, knowing that the true battle had only just begun. The air inside Mrs. Whitaker's house grew heavy with anticipation, the distant wail of police sirens growing louder as Cameron, Nyonya Margaret, and Mrs. Whitaker prepared for what lay ahead. The adrenaline coursing through their veins mingled with fear and resolve, creating a potent cocktail that threatened to overwhelm them. "We need to make a plan," Cameron said, his mind racing. "Daniel is unstable, and we have to be prepared for anything. He's capable of terrible things." Nyonya Margaret nodded, her expression solemn. "I won't let him hurt anyone else. Not again." Mrs. Whitaker leaned closer, her voice low but firm. "We need to understand what's happening to him. What drove him to this darkness? If we can find that, maybe we can reach him." "But how?" Cameron asked, his brow furrowing in frustration. "He's lost in whatever power he's tapped into." As the sirens drew nearer, a loud crash echoed from the front of the house, followed by the unmistakable sound of breaking glass. They all froze, fear gripping their hearts. "He's trying to get in," Nyonya Margaret gasped. "Get back," Cameron shouted, pushing them away from the door as he raced to secure the windows. The tension crackled in the air, every moment feeling heavier than the last. He could hear Daniel's voice, distorted and full of rage, echoing from outside. "I'll find you. You can't hide from me," Daniel screamed, his tone laced with desperation and fury. "You think you can turn your back on me? I'm stronger than you ever realized." Cameron's heart pounded in his chest as he glanced at Nyonya Margaret, who was clutching her hands together, fear etched on her face. "We need to hold him off until the police arrive," he said, determination flooding his voice. "If we can just buy some time." But even as he spoke, the shadows began to creep under the doorframe, curling around the edges like tendrils reaching for warmth. The air grew colder, and an oppressive weight settled in the room, smothering them in dread. Cameron, Mrs. Whitaker cried, her voice rising in panic. "We can't let him in." Cameron quickly barricaded the door with a nearby bookshelf, his heart racing. "We need to find something to defend ourselves with." Suddenly, the lights flickered ominously, casting long shadows that danced along the walls. The atmosphere shifted, the room feeling like it was closing in around them. Cameron grabbed a heavy lamp, ready to face whatever came through that door. "Margaret, stay behind me," he instructed, positioning himself protectively in front of her and Mrs. Whitaker. Cameron Nyanya Margaret's voice trembled. What if he gets in? Then we'll fight, he replied, trying to sound braver than he felt. We're not going to let him hurt you. As if in response to his declaration, the door buckled violently under the weight of Daniel's rage, splintering at the edges. You think you can stop me, he bellowed, his voice echoing with a dark resonance. You have no idea what I'm capable of. With a loud crash, the door burst open, sending the bookshelf crashing to the side. Daniel stood there, framed by darkness, his eyes wild and filled with an unsettling mix of anger and desperation. The shadows writhed around him like angry serpents, twisting and flickering in the dim light. Cameron's breath caught in his throat as he faced the boy he once knew, now transformed into something unrecognizable. Daniel, he shouted, his voice echoing through the chaos. You don't have to do this. You can still fight it. Fight what? Daniel retorted, his voice laced with bitterness. You think I'm lost? I've embraced my power. You're the ones who don't understand. The darkness around him surged forward, lashing out like a living creature. Cameron raised the lamp defensively, but before he could act, the shadows struck, slamming him against the wall with brutal force. Cameron Nyanya Margaret screamed, rushing forward, but Mrs. Whitaker grabbed her arm, pulling her back. No, stay behind me, she shouted, her eyes fierce. Cameron struggled to regain his footing, feeling the weight of the darkness pressing down on him, threatening to swallow him whole. He pushed against it, focusing on the boy Daniel used to be. You're stronger than this, he shouted, trying to break through the fog of rage that enveloped him. You don't know what it's like, Daniel yelled back, his voice filled with anguish. You don't know the things I've seen, the pain I've endured. This is my chance to rise above. The shadows roared in response, swirling violently around him, but within that chaos, Cameron caught a glimpse of the boy he had once known. Daniel, please, he cried. This isn't who you are. You're hurting the people who love you. A flicker of hesitation crossed Daniel's face, and for a moment the shadows stilled. Love, he echoed, confusion replacing the rage. What do you know about love? Cameron seized the moment, pushing against the darkness with all his might. I know that it's stronger than any power. We can help you, but you have to let us in. You have to choose to fight back. But as he spoke, the shadows surged again, amplifying Daniel's turmoil. I can't, he screamed, and the darkness twisted around him like a violent storm. I won't lose control again. Then don't, Cameron shouted, desperation flooding his voice. You're not a monster. You can fight this. With a primal roar, Daniel flung his arms wide, and the shadows lashed out, sending Cameron sprawling to the ground. Get away from me, he screamed, rage and fear colliding within him. Nyanya Margaret stepped forward, her voice trembling but resolute. Daniel, listen to me. You don't have to do this. You have a choice. You can come back to us. Shut up, Daniel screamed, his voice a mixture of agony and anger. You don't know what it's like. You don't understand the power I possess. The darkness around him writhed violently, and Cameron struggled to his feet, heart racing as he faced his friend. We're not afraid of you, Daniel, he yelled, his voice strong. We just want to help you. Suddenly, Daniel staggered back, his expression shifting. Help, he whispered, the shadows hesitating for the briefest moment. You want to help me? Yes, Nyanya Margaret shouted, tears streaming down her cheeks. We love you, Daniel. We want to save you from this. In that instant, the darkness flickered, momentarily waning as Daniel's internal battle raged on. But just as hope ignited, a surge of anger swept through him, and the shadows exploded outward, slamming into Cameron and knocking him back again. Stay away from me, Daniel howled, his voice filled with desperation. You don't know what I can do. Cameron gritted his teeth, determination flooding his veins. But you're still my friend. We can figure this out together. In that moment, the sirens grew louder, piercing through the chaos. The distant sound of approaching officers echoed in the background, bringing with it a glimmer of hope. Daniel, Cameron called, desperation clinging to his every word. You don't have to face this alone. We're here for you. Help me, Daniel suddenly shouted, his voice cracking as he struggled against the shadows that threatened to consume him whole. The darkness roiled, but for the first time it seemed uncertain. Fight it, Nyanya Margaret urged, her voice rising above the cacophony. You can be free. Just let us help you. As the shadows began to recede, Daniel's face contorted with anguish, caught between the darkness and the light. I don't know how he cried, tears streaming down his face. Just reach out, Cameron shouted, extending his hand toward Daniel, who stood at the precipice of his own destruction. Take my hand. We'll find a way out together. For a brief moment, Daniel hesitated, his hand trembling as he fought against the shadows that clawed at him. I don't want to hurt you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper.